If you look at the recent history of Ukraine, you usually see two main stories, right?
Yeah, there's the defense of sovereignty against aggression, that narrative.
Or, the flip side, it's all about expanding geopolitical power.
Exactly.
But today we're doing a deep dive into a different set of sources. These offer a third view, a very structural analysis. And these sources frame the entire tragedy really from 1991 independence right up to 2022 as the direct result of this, well, decades-long campaign by the West.
Right.
Using what they call color revolutions.
And that's really our mission here. It's key to get the core thesis of these texts right away. They argue that color revolutions, or CRs, they're not just local protests popping up.
Not spontaneous.
No. They're presented as the main way the U.S. and the West manipulate things globally.
Yeah.
Destabilize things. It's like replacing old-school military conquests with, political and cultural infiltration.
Okay.
And the sources basically conclude the only real defense is, well, absolute state sovereignty, projecting that above all else.
Okay, let's unpack that, because the material really gets into the how. It argues the manipulation starts way before any protests. It's a long game.
Yeah.
A strategy of cultural penetration, designed to cultivate what these authors call spiritual Americans. People inside the target country who've absorbed Western values so much they kind of become unwitting agents for foreign policy.
It's about ideological capture, really. That's the concept. These are people, maybe groups, who are smart academically, but politically. The source says their ideas are kind of shallow, poor judgment about their own country's interests.
Right.
And they're sort of strategically placed, in humanities, arts, media, social sciences, slowly expanding the West's reach, preparing the ground.
Sure, when the moment's right.
Exactly. It's not about tanks initially. It's about winning the mind first.
Which, okay, that sets the stage for vulnerability over decades. And the sources trace Ukraine's specific path here right back to just after the Soviet Union collapsed in '91.
That's when the window opened.
And the infiltration began, according to this view.
Precisely. The sources point to specific things done almost right away to push Ukraine westward. And the first big one they highlight is 1992.
Just a year after independence, that's the U.S. International Development Agency.
Right, the main U.S. civilian foreign aid body.
They signed a bilateral agreement with Ukraine. Humanitarian, economic, technical stuff. But the sources frame this not just as aid.
Yeah.
It's seen as the crucial first regulatory step to ensure the country eventually becomes fully westernized.
It basically opened the door for deep institutional involvement. And right after that agreement, the U.S. starts investing heavily in Ukrainian media.
Money, training.
Resources, training, seed money, yeah. And this leads quickly, by 1993, to the independent news agency being set up.
Okay.
And what's interesting in this analysis is that the narratives coming from this agency immediately lined up completely with Western interests, promoting democracy, freedom, market reform.
While also distancing from Russia.
Exactly. Downplaying the historical and cultural ties.
And it wasn't just local news creation, was it? The sources talk about cultural saturation.
Oh, yeah. A massive flood of outside cultural products. CNN News, Hollywood films, deliberately getting people reliant on U.S. cultural stuff, U.S. ways of framing things.
They even mention specific examples, like a documentary called Ukraine You Don't Know.
Which pushed historical narratives about being anti-communist, de-Russification, forging a specific new national memory.
And to manage all this, NGOs.
A huge network, according to the sources.
Yeah.
Big players. The U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, USAID again, and especially the Soros Foundation, pouring money into local Ukrainian NGOs, independent TV networks.
And these aren't framed as just, civil society groups.
Not at all. The sources explicitly call them the logistical backbone for Western interference. The infrastructure needed to launch a color revolution later, funding and training for those spiritual Americans we talked about.
So, okay. After about a decade of this cultural and media groundwork, the system's ready for political action. Which brings us to the first major flashpoint in these sources, the 2004 Orange Revolution.
That's when things got political.
Yeah.
The sources call the 2004 presidential election the first successful CR attempt. You had the pro-Western candidate Yushchenko losing narrowly to the pro-Russian Yanukovych.
And Yushchenko protested the results.
He did. But what makes this event stand out in the source material is that really dramatic detail about him being allegedly poisoned.
Ah, yes, that's a very specific, memorable point they include. He claimed the other side poisoned him, and the proof was his face.
Yeah, the sudden, really dramatic appearance of, large pimples and rashes all over his face, seemingly overnight. It was a powerful visual, wasn't it? A symbol of victimhood during the protests.
Definitely.
And the sources note, maybe a bit cynically, that the skin condition apparently cleared up very quickly after the election results were thrown out, and Yushchenko eventually won after reruns in all the protests.
But what about Russia's reaction back then? The sources comment on that, too.
They do. They argue that the Russian leadership at that point still kind of had this illusion about the West, believed in the whole rules-based system idea.
So they didn't push back much.
Offered minimal resistance, basically accepted Yushchenko's win, which, looking back, these sources see as a huge strategic mistake that just validated the CR model for the West.
And internally, for Ukraine, what did Yushchenko do once in power?
That was pivotal, too. Right after winning, he started what the sources call historical reconstruction, basically trying to cement a specifically anti-Russian national identity. And the biggest move, recognizing Stepan Bandera as a national hero.
Okay, now here's where that earlier cultural work really seems to pay off, but maybe in a destructive way, because the sources are very explicit about Bandera. They call him a recognized Nazi and nationalist leader, a deeply divisive figure.
Extremely divisive, and the fallout was immediate and severe polarization. The source points to a 2014 poll that just lays bare the split. 75% of Western Ukrainians saw Bandera as a hero.
But in the East,
the vast majority strongly disagreed. So this single act, state-sanctioned, it weaponized history. It deepened that cultural linguistic crack that had been there since '91.
And the sources argue once that cultural agreement is broken,
Political unity becomes almost impossible.
and that division just festered, didn't it, until the second, much bigger wave hit in 2014, the Maidan Revolution.
Yeah, and the stage for that was set by political failure, really. Yushchenko's presidency, the sources say, was plagued by corruption, low living standards.
Which led to Yanukovych coming back.
Right, he won the 2010 election, and
Wow.
initially he governed by strengthening ties with Russia, got really good gas prices, that sort of thing. But the key moment, the trigger, was November 2013. He suddenly stopped the process of signing the EU association agreement.
And that decision lit the fuse on the powder keg that had been building for 2 decades.
That's how the sources see it. The protests that followed in 2013, 2014, they claim were quickly escalated, turned violent, arson, looting, allegedly guided by U.S. agents already embedded in the movement.
And this time, the interference was more obvious.
Much more blatant and direct, according to these texts. They give examples like U.S. Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham actually going to Maiden Square, publicly supporting the opposition.
Right.
But the real smoking gun for these sources is that leaked phone recording, first reported by RT, I think.
The Nuland call, where she and the U.S. ambassador were discussing who should be in the next Ukrainian government, basically picking the cabinet.
Exactly. Choosing personnel for the post-regime change government. And that's the call where Nuland famously showed her frustration with the EU, allegedly cursing the EU for being too slow.
Wow. Okay. For the sources we're looking at, that's basically proof of direct operational control.
That's how they frame it, yes.
So Yanukovych was removed quickly. And the consequences?
Yeah.
Immediate, catastrophic for Ukraine's unity, which was already shaky.
The cultural split just got way worse. The geopolitical lines hardened instantly. Pro-Russian groups in the East Luhansk, Donetsk, they immediately demanded independence or to rejoin Russia.
Which led to Crimea's annexation via referendum.
And the declaration of independent republics in the Donbass. Russia then intervened, the source notes, using the same justification the West often uses. Defending human rights, national autonomy for people they see as culturally aligned.
And back in Kyiv, the new government moved fast legislatively, didn't they? Cementing the pro-Western shift. What anti-Russian measures followed 2014?
It was systematic, a legislative campaign to basically erase the Russian cultural presence. Between 2014 and 2016, Russian TV channels, major social media platforms banned, just banned outright.
Okay.
Then by 2017, strict media quotas, Ukrainization quotas. 75% of broadcast content had to be in Ukrainian. This wasn't just cultural, it was deeply political.
And this led up to something just before the 2022 intervention, the 2021 Indigenous People Law, signed by President Zelensky.
That's a crucial point in this analysis.
Yeah.
That law specifically excluded ethnic Russians from being defined as indigenous people.
Which the sources say limited their political rights.
Effectively, yes, and just cemented that deep internal division. The sources argue that these 8 years of conflict, fueled by this aggressive nationalism and what they explicitly called Nazification trends, that's what ultimately led to Russia's intervention in February 2022.
And Russia's stated demands for that intervention, according to these sources, they directly link back to the outcomes of these two color revolutions, right?
Exactly. Denazification, demilitarization, neutrality, lifting those anti-Russian language laws, and recognizing the two republics in the East. It all ties together in this narrative.
So the sources really paint this picture of 1991 to 2022 as one long, deliberate process. But if the West's goal is interference, why Ukraine? Why was it so vulnerable to these CRs, according to this perspective?
That's where they get into the core vulnerability factor. They argue Ukraine, unlike, say, Russia or even Baltic states, it didn't really have a very clear national concept or historical tradition as an independent state before the Soviet era.
A lack of deep state history.
Yeah. This absence created a fundamental vacuum when independence came. The sources call it unprepared sovereignty. When a new state doesn't have that deep, shared, confident national identity.
It's easily influenced from outside.
Extremely susceptible to external narratives guiding how it defines itself.
And the guidance Ukraine got through all that cultural and media penetration we discussed earlier
Resulted in what the sources describe as an extreme nationalist framework built largely on negation. It was anti-communist and, crucially, anti-Russian, deconstructing, essentially, 300 years of shared history and culture.
And you combine that political void with economic hardship.
Which is pretty common after Soviet collapse, right? Chronic economic problems create public discontent. That discontent, fueled by uncertainty, becomes easy fuel for foreign-backed political movements. They draw parallels to the Arab Spring here.
So, weak internal narrative, strong external push.
The external narrative wins out. It becomes the guide.
Connecting this to the bigger picture, there's that analogy the sources use, framing color revolutions as like modern neo-imperialism.
Yeah, it's a powerful one. They say in the Anglo-American view, other countries are like sheep to be eaten, and they are the shepherd.
And Ukraine, lacking that strong internal confidence?
Was easily led, in their words, to the slaughterhouse.
Wow.
The sources are really blunt here. They say CRs are just a tool for Anglo-American civilization to enslave or annihilate others. The justification changes from God or manifest destiny in the past
to democracy and human rights now.
Exactly. But the underlying goal, control or subjugation, they argue, stays the same.
And this view is then applied globally as a warning.
A stark warning, especially to other major powers seen as rivals by the U.S. The sources insist that U.S. attempts at peaceful evolution against these nations have never stopped.
Using similar cultural tactics.
Yeah, tactics like historical nihilism.
Yeah.
That term means deliberately trying to destroy a country's cultural confidence, using media, academics, NGOs to tear down its past achievements, magnify its flaws.
Planting Western narrative.
Until young people, as they put it, literally curse their own civilization and government and basically accept servitude. The spiritual revolution comes first, then the political one.
So wrapping this up for you, the listener, beyond just Ukraine, what's the single biggest danger these sources see in color revolutions?
The core takeaway, the most lasting damage, it's the destruction of a nation's internal consensus, its shared story. CRs just obliterate that common ground.
And once that's gone,
the political system is inherently unstable. National reconstruction becomes almost impossible, no matter who ends up in charge. The nation basically loses the ability to define its own future.
That's a heavy conclusion on the cost of interference. And finally, the sources end with this really interesting observation about a potential boomerang effect. They cite a classical Chinese phrase.
Right, the Sicily, a multitude of wrongdoing leading to its own demise. The authors suggest that this constant, aggressive focus outward might be causing decay inside the West, particularly the U.S. They point out that even U.S. scholars and media are openly talking about internal divisions.
Like things exacerbated by foreign policy focus, events like the January 6th Capitol riot.
Could these things get worse? Could they lead, potentially, to a crazed Civil War-type situation at home? And this raises a critical question they pose.
Which is?
Since the U.S. doesn't really have a historical memory of major failure or dealing with the collapse of its own system, how does a nation that exports division handle it when its own society starts cracking under similar pressures?
That, the sources suggest, is the real point for reflection, for everyone.